Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. Thanks for joining me. As always, it's great to talk with you and get the great feedback about all these topics. And most of the topics I get are from you, so thank you for that. This week, we've got our solar eclipse glasses ready to go, and I've been waiting to talk about this until the week before, even though the hype has been happening for months and months, and in some cases, years and years. We are less than a week away from the solar eclipse here in East Aurora. And I have done quite a bit of research into the history of the eclipse, solar eclipses in East Aurora specifically. The Buffalo news stations and the Buffalo newspaper have talked about previous eclipses. I think the New York Times actually wrote about it. So you're probably inundated with stories about previous eclipses and why this one is so special. But I've narrowed down my research into the reaction right here in our own community, because I thought it would be kind of interesting to see how East Aurora reacted to these previous eclipses, solar eclipses specifically, and even more specifically, total solar eclipses in which we are in the zone of totality. And I had a friend a couple weeks ago where it was like, I don't know what the big deal is. It's just the moon going in between us and the sun, and no big deal. It's actually quite a big deal. Anyone I've talked to who's experienced a zone of totality during a solar eclipse, it says it's just such a surreal experience. And I think it's one of the things that brings us together as people. We all have a common thing to look forward to. And it's just the talks kind of symbolizes the power of nature, and it's just kind of neat. And there's a lot of history behind it, behind how cultures viewed these eclipses. So I think it's quite interesting to study, and it's quite interesting thing to experience. One of the big things about it is there's very few things that we look forward to that are truly. You were hearing these people say that this is a once in a lifetime experience. This is actually even more than that. And I kind of called it the once in more than a lifetime experience, because there are the frequency of being in a zone of totality in your home where you live, is once every 150 years if you're lucky. So this is truly a once in more than a lifetime experience. Um, I talk about a friend of mine who's approaching 100 years old. She was alive the last time there was a total solar eclipse here, that we were in the zone of totality. But of course, she doesn't remember it. She was practically a newborn, less than a year old or a year old. So this is truly a magical event, and once in more than a lifetime event for this individual. For her, it's two times, but she doesn't remember the first time, of course. So with that said, yeah, I've been getting asked a lot, and it's been in the news, the previous time that we were in the zone of totality. Now, I've written about the eclipse. It's going to appear in the Easter Advertiser. It's my monthly newspaper column. They're holding it a little bit beyond the usual time that my column usually runs because of the timing of the eclipse. So I did a lot of research into it, and so that will be in an upcoming issue of the Easter Advertiser. But I'm going to give you a little preview of some of the things that I've researched, and answered some of the questions. And I've gotten a couple questions as I've been chatting with folks about the eclipse, as well as just questions that I had on my own mind. So I was able to answer them for myself as well. So the previous eclipse, now there's two kinds of eclipses. There's one where there's just a partial eclipse. So nowhere would you see it where it's an annular eclipse where it only partially blocks the sun. And that would be, there's no zone of totality with those. So the moon itself is just not blocking the sun. Um, and the moon is just so far away that it doesn't completely block the sun anywhere. Then there's total eclipses, which is what's going to happen on April 8th, where the moon does block out the whole sun. It's close enough to the Earth to create a total blockage. Now, we've seen this before. We've experienced that before, even people in our lifetime. Um, but we're not usually in the zone of totality. So that makes a big difference. You can experience a total solar eclipse, but if you're not in the zone of totality, you don't get the totality experience. That happened in 2017. So a lot of the research that I did was after either before or after the 2017 eclipse, because I was just we were about 70% covered then here in East Aurora. And it was interesting, and you got to watch on TV other regions of the country get the zone of totality. Um, and so, in anticipation of what's going to happen next week, I started doing research. That was 2017. So funny that back then it seemed like 2024 was going to be so far away, and that we would have to wait a long time for our turn for the total eclipse. But here it is. So I did a lot of research then, and it's funny how our perspective has changed. Back then, again, it was seemed like it was so far away, not really excited about it as much as we are now. Um, and so it was sort of a more abstract research, kind of like, oh, interesting eclipses. Well, now it's more interesting, I think, for me anyway, because we are on top of this next eclipse. So we've only really had two total eclipses where we have been in the zone of totality since the pioneer settlers have come. The one of them was in excuse me in January 24th of 1925 was the last one, and June 16th of 1806. I wanted to make sure I checked the dates for you. Was the one before that. So from 1806 to 1925, that's a huge span of time. Now, we don't have a lot of research on the one, a lot of documentation on the one from 1806. Native Americans were living here. There were previous ones to that where there would have been humans living here, but we don't have written documentation of it. Um, and frankly, we had very few families of European descent, the settlers, pioneer settlers living in our area at the time. And there were no newspapers that documented it from an East Aurora perspective. So we don't have anything that tells us what people experienced during that, and we'll talk a little bit later about why we should have had some documentation about it, but we don't. We know it happened because the scientists tell us this, and we know people were living here at the time, and we know the zone of totality came over East Aurora. But other than that, we don't know much about anything about the total solar eclipse of June 16th, 1806. Well, the next one was January 24th, 1925. There was a lot of anticipation of this one. Actually, the East Aurora Advertiser was publishing at the time, and beginning around December, they had been talking about it for a while, but there was an entire two columns of the East Aurora Advertiser in December of 1924, December 4th to be exact, where they explained the scientific details of an eclipse and talked about how exciting it was going to be that we were going to be in the zone of totality. And for the next few weeks, they were talking about how special this was, how rare it was, and that we should all go out and watch it. Adding to the excitement of that eclipse in 1925 was a world-renowned astronomer, Edwin B. Frost, the week before the eclipse, visited East Aurora High School, which was the middle school on Main Street, and he gave a presentation about eclipses, scientific presentation. Um, a lot of people wanted to go see it. A lot of people wanted to go talk about it. Now, remember, this is the days before television and very early days before radio. So, all the things we're watching on TV today about eclipses, the imagery we're seeing of eclipses, they would not have had that in 1925. They would not have had computer simulations of what it was going to look like. There would have been no video of what previous eclipses look like. So it was sort of a really foreign concept to a lot of people in 1925 of what this was going to look like. So they all wanted to go hear the scientists talk about it. It would have been pretty interesting, I would imagine. Uh, about his lecture was total eclipses and what they mean. So he wanted to, he was coming to talk about it. So I imagine a lot of folks would want to go. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough room in the high school auditorium, so it was only open to students and faculty. So the advertiser the following week, which would have been the week before the eclipse, published a very detailed description of his presentation, which was quite helpful. Um, and so there was great anticipation not only here in East Aurora but across the path of totality. What's different between 1925 and today? Um, Back then, 1925's eclipse occurred on a Saturday morning after about 9 a.m. So there was no concern about closing school like there is today. Kids being on school buses, that sort of thing. There were still activities. There were things canceled because of the eclipse. But the idea of school and children being on school buses, that wasn't a problem back then. First, because most students were not on school buses back then, but also it was a Saturday morning. And so some offices were open, stores were open, would have been open normally, but the school was a big factor of that. So there wasn't that issue. One of the big differences between 1925 and today is they issued warnings like they did today about protecting your eyes. There were a lot of eye doctors and optometrists concerned that people were going to stare directly into the sun, and not on purpose, but damage their eyes. And they didn't have these cardboard eclipse glasses. These have become sort of a souvenir kind of thing. And if you haven't been able to get one by now, I don't know where you've been, because they've been giving them out for free at the libraries. They've been selling them in stores for past couple years, at least a couple years, and really ramping it up in the past couple months. Back in 1925, they didn't have these special glasses. So they actually advised people to smoke glass, actually take a flame and smoke glass in order to look at the sun. And they were saying that that would protect your eyes. Certainly not as protective as these. I would imagine some people might not have smoked them enough, or smoked them too much, and they wouldn't have been able to get an image. And it would have taken a little time. You just don't go pick up your glasses from the local library. You would have had to prepare your smoked glass. So that was a big difference between then and now. Besides it happening on a Saturday, the glasses were different, but the excitement was the exact same. The newspapers were talking about it for weeks and months. Here in East Aurora, the students were really excited to be in the zone of totality. Um, One of the things that I thought this was really interesting, there were two things that I thought were interesting, is the New York Times actually published an editorial the morning of that eclipse in 1925. And they talked about, and I talk about this in my column that you'll be able to read in more detail if you so desire, but how the sort of the how we took for granted, they're talking in 1925, but even thought it really applies to us today as well, is how we can predict these. The scientists and the New York Times was talking about the power of science and the importance of science to be able to predict um, pretty much exactly where and when this was going to happen, and how the scientists needed to be given credit for being able to predict this event. Um, and I thought that was quite interesting, that there's a lot of hype over something only because the scientists tell us it's going to happen. And that previous to being able to ancient times where you hear stories of people finding it to have some sort of religious significance, or even the end of the world sort of feelings. Well, of course they did, because if they didn't know it was coming, and all of a sudden in the middle of the day the sun's being blocked out, and you had no idea it was happening ahead of time, first of all, there wouldn't have been hype like we're having today about it. Um, but there would have been some worry about, imagine that your sun's being blocked in the middle of the day, um, and you don't know why, and the fear. And the New York Times pointed out that 99 years ago, pointed out the day of the eclipse, that how wonderful it is that we know, and that some of that fear is taken away. Even still, though, there's been stories, and I've been trying to confirm. There's a couple. I've been asked about a local story where a family sold off their farmland, and their farm animals, or even sacrificed some of their farm animals, killed them, or and took care of all their worldly, earthly loose ends, because they felt that the eclipse, even in 1925, the eclipse in 1925, was the end of days, and they had a religious belief that this was a signal of the end of the days. Um, of course, previous eclipses didn't end that way, but they really believed that this particular eclipse was going to end that way. And I can't verify the local story about that, about a local family who did that. It's just a local legend that has been brought out. But in my research, I did find a Rochester area man who they published an article about him in the New York Times, that he did. He sold off he killed his livestock, and he sold off his land, and they kind of sort of made fun of him in the news article, saying he was just going to sit and wait on his land for the big show to happen of the rapture, or the end of days associated with the eclipse. Now, of course, I couldn't find any follow up to find out what he said after the fact, even though nothing really happened to that effect. But those ideas were still perpetuated even back in 1925, which I found very interesting, even though they had been long being able to predict when these were going to happen. And so today we can predict to the precision of the eclipse, which changes how we view the eclipse. Imagine not even knowing that next week was going to happen, that that celestial phenomenon wasn't going to happen. We know the exact minute. We know exactly how long it's going to take. And that didn't happen before. Even when they could predict it. So I'm imagining, back in the early 1800s when we had the first of the three that we're able to talk about, um, that even though scientists could predict at that point, or they could know about it, even if they could, there's no way really that local residents here in East Aurora would have gotten news of it ahead of time. There weren't really newspapers, so it would be interesting to know the reaction of the folks when I don't think they might have known about it unless they read about it in a not far off newspaper and far enough advance that they got in the mail that they picked up, every couple months. But it's highly doubtful that they may have known ahead of time like we do today, even in the early 1800s here in East Aurora, or what became East Aurora. So that would be interesting, that the difference between us today living in the same spot, in the same location as the folks who were here 200 years ago, 20 years ago, what they would have thought. So I just find that interesting that our perspective, same eclipse, same kind of event, but how our perspective is different about it today, just because of media and science. It's and the communication that's afforded to us via everything, TV, radio, and the internet. Um, and then, of course, in 1925, they didn't have internet. So, like today, I know a lot of us are going on the maps online to look at the exact path, to see a map of what's going to happen, and simulations. You can watch video simulations of what's going to happen. They couldn't have done that in 1925. So, it's quite interesting how the three different eclipses just here in East Aurora are so different with our reaction to them. Now, not to give away the ending, but in 1925, there was a lot of hype about it. And unfortunately, that morning, everybody got their smoke glasses ready and were out on, uh, presumably outside, looking to the sky, and a cloud cover came over. And according to the East Aurora Advertiser, they had a very pessimistic view after the fact. They just said, "Oh, yep, we didn't even, the eclipse was basically ruined." They said that we got our glasses ready for nothing, um, and which I find interesting because even with cloud cover, there is an effect. So you wouldn't be able to look up and see the corona around the sun with your smoked glasses. But there would have been darkness. There would have been something happening. They've said this. So even next week, if it does um, get cloudy, there will still be an effect. We will know there's an eclipse. And I found it interesting that the Easter Advertiser didn't really mention. They kind of were like, "Oh well, the clouds ruined everything." Yeah, they did, but there was still something going on, and they had this little teeny paragraph on the following week's paper, and that was kind of like, yeah, and it was on the inside of the paper, so they made no big deal after the fact. Buffalo newspapers, clouds went over Buffalo as well, but they were talking about people were still out on the streets. The city was in darkness for a while, as it does during the totality. They were much more descriptive in the Buffalo newspapers about it, even though it was the same effect. Now, further east, they did get the full effect of it. New York City points further east of in New York State along the path. We This eclipse next week is going to be more south to north, and the eclipse back in 1925 was more west to east. So the path was different, and we were just on it in both instances. Um, so that brings me to if recommending. Some people are like, how do we record the eclipse? Uh, Now I think there's going to be a lot of people taking pictures. They're talking about making sure you're safe with your phones and everything. Um, and instead of taking a picture of the sun, that's interesting, but there's going to be a ton of people doing that. And the media is going to be doing that, and you're going to see it all on TV and everything. Is take pictures of the people you're with, take pictures and videos of people's reactions. That has more value, I think, to history. If you want to share that with the archive at the town historian's office, feel free, or save it for your own for your own family history, what your grandchildren are going to wonder about your reaction to the eclipse of the great eclipse of 2024. But it's the people's reaction around you more so than pointing your camera up to the sun, because everybody's going to be doing that. But not everybody is going to record the reaction of the people around you, who you were with at the time. Um, and if you want to videotape something, that's something I would videotape, the reaction around you. Secondly, one of the things I'm really was upset about in my research was there was no, besides the Easter Advertiser and their little paragraph the week after in 1925, which was kind of a bummer, to be honest. There was no description. They kind of were like, before the eclipse, it was all wonderful, very detailed coverage. But then once the clouds came over, and I think the editors were really disappointed, they just kind of recorded that it happened, but they didn't talk in much detail. We don't. I could not find any diaries from that time period. I would have loved a diary of someone's personal experience in watching the eclipse. I am assuming the streets were full of people in 1925, um, of people waiting for the eclipse, even though it was cloudy. But I don't have any record of that in the newspaper because the editor of the paper at the time, chose not to cover it very well. Well, that's a shame. And if the people around town were keeping diaries at that time, they might have, most likely would have mentioned it in their diary, and that would be a great historic resource today. So if, and I've talked about keeping diaries and keeping a journal before. There's even a previous video about it. But if you want to start, if there's any time you want to start doing a journal, maybe the eclipse is a good time to start it, because believe me, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren will want to know what you were thinking and your experience with the eclipse. Just like today, we're all looking back at 1925, and we want to know what people were doing. And so it kind of gives you the everyday person's diary, journal. I just posted yesterday on the town historians page about Mr. Bragg, who lived in South Wales, and he got to journal from when he was like 16 years old all the way through most of his life. And we know daily things happening, including an eclipse. Unfortunately, his lifespan did not did not include a full total eclipse, so I couldn't look and see. Actually, I should probably look to see if there's any partial eclipses. But journals are very important to the record of history, not just what's included in the newspaper. So feel free to, I would highly recommend, in addition to videotaping who you're with and the reaction, is to document your feelings about the eclipse and things going on around you, not just during the eclipse, but in your life. Um, and the eclipse is one of the eclipse next week is one of these moments where I'm thinking, well, where I really talk about, the importance of recording our history for future generations. History is just as much about today and the future as it is the past. So, and I always think of that too, as I'm frustrated with the lack of documentation over things like the 1925 eclipse. Being like, well, what can we do today to fix that problem for future generations who are trying to do research? Um, Lastly, I've talked about the two total solar eclipses and how cool it would have been if the early 1800s one, 1805 eclipse, um, uh, would have had somebody who was writing a journal at the time. Wouldn't that be cool? Um, and But nobody was. Actually, it was 1806. I said 1805. Sorry. So the June 16th, 1806. Imagine someone had a journal sitting here in East Aurora writing down what was happening, even though we had no TV or cell phones or newspapers to record it if somebody was here, but we didn't. So that's the importance of journaling. Um, Partial eclipses have actually generated a ton of excitement too. 1994, I remember this one when I was in high school. Um, we were in the direct path of a partial eclipse, of an annular eclipse, so we didn't get the full effect. Um, and then there was one, we had a partial view of a total eclipse in 1932. And actually, if you want to see all the previous eclipses, whether they be solar, lunar, partial, total, timeanddate.com, a website, you can look up all the eclipses, and the paths of the eclipses, and it's really interesting information if you wanted to dig deep into that. But on August 31st of 1932, we had a partial view of a total eclipse, And the advertiser then, unlike it did in 1925, they had a very detailed description of all the people who came out. The businesses closed. They came out onto Main Street. They had special sunglasses, which were they were still smoking glasses, and to look up at the sky at the partial eclipse. They talked about how people were sharing the smoked glasses so everybody could get a view of it, and how exciting it was on Main Street. So we have this really interesting record of what happened during that partial eclipse, and I really wish we had that record of the 1925 one as well. But they said that Main Street came to a standstill, and it was kind of funny. They said now the eclipse is over, we can get back to work, and the excitement's behind us, because even when it was only a partial view of a total eclipse, East Aurora was really excited about it, and that was in 1932. So I leave you with this: if um, if you're not as excited about the eclipse as other people around you, I don't know what to say, because this really truly is a once in more than a lifetime experience. So, and even if the clouds go over East Aurora, it'll still be an interesting experience. It's still a total eclipse. However, at least now the weather report's looking pretty good. So if it's a sunny day and we get to view the eclipse and the corona, it will truly be a really rare event, because the one in 1925 was obstructed by clouds. Um, it's really going to be making history more than just over 100 years. It's even more than that, because our previous eclipse was not ideal. So this may be, especially if the weather cooperates, this might be a pretty historic event, more so than the on paper tells us. So it's very, very very interesting. I'm actually looking forward to it. And so write down what, if you have a diary, write down your reaction to it, the feeling you have, the traffic. All these things will be interesting to people in the future. And so East Aurora will not have this happen again. We will not be in the path of totality until October 26th of 2144. None of us will be around. And so I just picture people having a diary or a recollection of the eclipse, that people in 2144, leading up to that total eclipse, what they're going to look back on, what we experienced here in East Aurora. So it's, I think, really important to document what you experience. Um, it might seem silly. It's just, it's an eclipse, but it's really interesting how we as humans get excited about this, and we are very anticipatory about it. And that same feeling is going to happen in 2144, I'd imagine. Maybe not, but history has told us that that anticipation and excitement over this celestial event is the same. We have not changed. The technology has changed, but our excitement over it has not. The hype beforehand is very similar this year as it was in 1925. So, and I anticipate, despite technology advances, it's hard to tell. We can't predict the future, but I anticipate human nature won't change so much that there won't be that same anticipation in 2144. It's really hard to fathom 2144, even though we're in, because we're just in 2024. So anyway, thank you for joining me. Get your eclipse glasses ready. We'll next time I chat with you in a live stream will be after the eclipse, and I'll probably chat a little bit about that experience next time. Again, thanks for joining me. I am Robert Goller, and as always, these videos are also available on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Robert Lowell Goller, if it's easier for you to watch them there. As always, thank you for keeping history alive and for supporting this project. I really appreciate it. And as always, your comments and feedback are welcome, either through private message or in the comments section. Thanks again. Happy eclipse, and we'll see you after the big event next week. Take care.